caffeinated and animated at this point, so please feel free to jot down any questions you may have in the chat window. I will have some time for Q&A at the end. I'll be happy to answer your questions. I'll be happy even to go past the hour if need be. So let's let this be the beginning of some conversation around outsmarting the bad guys, specifically making sure that your users don't get outsmarted. When we talk about users generally, we're talking about endpoint security, and this is a realm that has become certainly a hot topic in the past few years. Now, when we talk about the different players here, let's define some of them. And of course, when we talk about behavior and essentially the psychology of all of the different types of security aspects and issues that we're dealing with, we want to understand the motivations. So if we simplify it down to good guys versus bad guys, on the good guys, and certainly we have a collection here, a gathering of good guys, we have essentially two different flavors when it comes to security. There are the business users, of course, who we're generally tasked with supporting. Their motivations certainly are to accomplish their business goals, accomplish their personal goals, and in both cases, they want to do it fast, fast, fast. And so they want minimal things getting in their way. And sometimes, if you read between the lines, and certainly if you've been in IT or security for any amount of time, that can sometimes be a pain in your butt, which leads us to the security teams, which we're certainly motivated by a couple of things. Of course, we want to do both. We want to support accomplishing both business and personal goals of our user community, but we also want to make sure, excuse me, we also want to make sure that business is not disrupted in any way. We want to make sure that we're maintaining control of our environment. And our environment can be the systems, can be the users, can be the applications, certainly the infrastructure that's underneath all of those things. We want to make sure that that is maintained. Now, if we consider the motivations of the bad guys, we generally see three types of bad guys out there. There are the hacktivists that are really motivated to create some sort of chaos, disruption, embarrassment for organizations in order to support their cause or further their ideal. Generally, their motivations can be very up and down. There's a lot of different reasons that certain groups of people can be set off and attack different organizations, and we've seen certainly several examples of that in the past. Now, the most common thing that really makes the headlines is the next two, which is really around the criminal element, essentially stealing. Their motivation is to steal intellectual property, data, customer lists, what have you, for profit. Generally, that is what we're defending against. Of course, we're defending against all three of these on a regular basis. And the final, and really the most nefarious one is the nation-state actors, which their motivation certainly is to disrupt the global balance of power, certainly in their favor. These are, I say nefarious just because their funding is generally infinite, and their capabilities are also generally infinite. And without real clear targets all of the time, certainly there are very well-known targets, but certainly it can be anything from disrupting governmental operations, the infrastructure of power, generation, those types of things, nuclear. But also it can be just stealing intellectual property from organizations, let's say in the United States, for example, in order to better compete on the world stage. So again, it's about disrupting the balance of power, whether it's political or even economic. Now, consider, if you will, what we see oftentimes, let's say part of the goal of these bad guys is to turn some of their good guys that are internal to your organization certainly into bad guys or essentially assistants to the bad guys. So when you're considering your security program, you have to also consider that some of your good guys could also be working for the bad guys, and that's just a reality, and it's something that we've seen. I'll give you one example that one of my evangelist shares often, and it was an example where an employee of Motorola was traveling, going through TSA, and was just, through normal scanning, or even, I believe it was a random scan for additional screening, quote unquote. That person was found to have tens of thousands of dollars in cash on hand. And upon examination, that person was a Motorola employee. And it turns out that that person was traveling to China and had been leaking intellectual property for Motorola to a relative in China for years who worked for a competitor of Motorola and had made, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's an example where supposedly someone with access, a good guy, a business user, was helping some of the bad guys. So we see these examples all the time. Of course, from a law enforcement standpoint, it is very difficult to root out, but we know that these things are happening. Now, one of the biggest trends certainly within the security realm is ransomware. And we at Carbon Black, we just published a great executive e-guide called The Rise of Ransomware, or excuse me, Ransomware on the Rise. And in it is a nice timeline of the last 30 years of the development of ransomware, as you can see here. Now, one of the key things that we point out, and if you want to really talk about motivation, is if you look at the bottom there, in 2015, we saw $24 million of losses by victims to ransomware campaigns. In the first 3 months of 2016, that number was over $209 million. So essentially a 10x rise just in the first 3 months of this year alone. So projecting out towards the end of 2016, which we're coming on here, we expect there to be about $1 billion worth of victim losses in this year. Now, if you look at the timeline, you can see that in 1989, the first, what's considered the first ransomware was released, and it was acute by today's standards. It was called the AIDS Trojan, and the reason why I saw that name is that there were thousands of infected disks that were passed around at an AIDS conference, which then turned into essentially a little ransomware campaign. It just used, it was simple symmetric cryptography. The keys were on board, relatively easy to inoculate against, but ironically enough, it really set off in motion 30 years of development in this realm, to the point now where we're seeing things, some really interesting developments, and a lot of it is around obfuscation of the attacker. So, moving from a malware that's transferred where the attacker is generally known, payment is via some sort of credit card. There was no command and control. The keys were on board with the actual malware itself. To now, we see the Tor network being used for command and control. We see very sophisticated encryption being used, and of course, the attackers are requesting their payment in Bitcoin in order to obfuscate where payment is being set. But we've seen some interesting development over time. We've seen CryptoWall in 2014, which really added the first persistence to ransomware by adding registry keys to systems and also copying itself to the startup folder. We saw also in 2014 the first ransomware to start communicating the command and control server being in the Tor network in order to obfuscate its control. We also saw Tesla Crypt in 2015, which added some additional resiliency and persistence in order to allow the threat actor to maintain even after remediation techniques were used. And we see a lot more of that with Locky, which was really this year aggressive in terms of its phishing infrastructure in order to get into environments. We really saw the healthcare industry really be affected by Locky this year. And then also we saw SamSam, which was the first ransomware campaign to have a direct and real-time communication link between the victim and the attacker. So again, to shorten that time from the attack being successful to payment of the attacker. and on and on. And so what I will share with the team at iSECURE is this e-guide, and certainly I certainly encourage you to take a look at it. It's really good, very good history of ransomware and what to do about it. So if we look at enterprise ransomware, it has taken the notion of ransomware and leveraged user behavior in order to be able to propagate its existence, its persistence inside of the environment, and of course to really give the edge to the attacker and really give them leverage in order to harvest the largest ransom. So it all starts generally by some sort of phishing campaign, and this is really where the attackers do their homework. They're really understanding what will be the best way to get into the environment. So by looking at the organization, how it's structured, even to the point of looking at what users, the relationships between users inside of the environment, identifying the writing styles. So everything that will increase the likelihood that a user will click on a particular link inside of an email or download a particular file. And again, when we consider the behavior or the motivations of users, it's to accomplish their tasks, their goals very fast. So as you know, users will tend to click first, ask questions later, or really dial up support later in order to deal with the after effects. So the user clicks on a malicious link, a malicious file inside of an email. That sets in motion, drops some sort of exploit onto the system, and starts to set up communication back with the attacker. Now, one of the developments in ransomware has been around the persistence inside of the environment and the lateral movement. So really what ransomware has taken a note from a lot of other malicious campaigns inside of the environment by leveraging the administrative credentials, harvesting credentials, and then moving laterally inside of the network. Generally, patient zero is inconsequential. That's not the goal. It's to get inside of the environment and find critical systems and start to lock those up. And of course, as the campaign is moving forward inside of the environment, the keys are not not left. The encryption keys are not left inside of that environment. They're sent back into the cloud or back to the command and control server in order, again, to maintain leverage. And we're seeing hundreds of different types of files being encrypted on endpoints, which is, of course, increasing over time. We've seen a 200% increase year to year in the types of files that are being encrypted. So now this is where it starts to get really nefarious from a leverage standpoint. The goal now is to not spring the trap immediately. It's to make sure that some critical systems, servers within the environment receive the ransomware campaign, and then also that to lay low until that ransomware has entered a few backup cycles. And so when essentially the trap is sprung, users will attempt to then revert from backup in order to restore operations, and of course the ransomware campaign is already inside of those backups. And again, this is all done with the notion of increasing leverage over the victim in order to demand higher and higher ransoms. So you can imagine that this is big business. There's a lot of support around this, and we expect it, of course, to continue to increase. So now let's talk about how we can start to deal with this. How can we start to bring back the leverage to our side as security professionals in the industry? Now, generally, we have two types of security personnel. We have red teamers, or offensive security, more proactive security, let's say, and blue teamers, which are really focused on defensive security and essentially putting up the walls and protecting the fortress. Now, I realize the Jets were green uniforms, but the picture really spoke to what I wanted to present here. Incidentally, this game happened about a year ago, and you notice that the teams are wearing red and green uniforms. There were articles I saw where there were complaints against the NFL that people who are colorblind couldn't enjoy this game because of the red and green. I thought that was an interesting thing from this game. But essentially, there are two types of security, and we'll talk about that and how that plays into how we're practicing security today and how we're going to practice it in the future. So in terms of looking at your defenses, your security readiness over time, there are a number of different things that we can do from a security perspective. I'll focus here, of course, on endpoint security and really controlling the environment that where users are really going to be interacting with the most. And generally, that's going to be interaction with their own notebooks, desktops, and of course the back-end systems that support that, whether it's the servers, domain controllers, what have you, inside of your environment. So let's consider what are red team, offensive, and proactive type of activities, and let's consider blue team defensive activity from a security perspective. So when we consider how quickly can we get to a particular state, of course, your mileage can vary quite a bit in terms of the culture of your organization, the size of your organization, resources you may have on hand. But what we find is that whether it's a large organization or a small organization, there are still elements of each of these types of defenses that can be leveraged relatively quickly or can be applied to specific use cases within the environment. Let's start with level one. This is where we see probably the most immediate value in terms of what you can apply to your environment from an advanced endpoint perspective. There's this whole realm of next generation antivirus, which really, as you can tell, takes the existing antivirus, the practices there to another level. I'll describe that in a couple of more slides. But that's something that can be applied relatively quickly. It is a negative security model, so we're looking at blocking bad. But that is, again, something that you can do from a defensive, a blue team, defensive, reactive position. Now, once you start getting into level two, which is endpoint detection and response, this is where you can have some defensive, reactive activities as well as offensive. So this is where security operations, constantly looking at what's happening in the environment, or should there be an incident identified, being able to quickly do incident response. Those are certainly reactive type of operations. Or you can go on offense inside of your environment, do threat hunting, looking for the types of activities that are really show themselves time and time again to be the activity of a malicious actor inside of your environment. Now, the next two levels really focus on application control, and in particular, specific use cases within application control. The first in level three we see is using positive security model, which is to allow good and deny bad, for specific targeted systems, mission-critical systems like servers, domain controllers, web servers, database servers, or VIP systems like your C-suite or perhaps your financial team or HR team to protect critical data inside of your environment. That's what we see from a level three. And then from the ultimate level we see is doing application control enterprise-wide. So for every system inside of the environment, defining what is allowed to run over time. And when you consider what a malicious campaign is, it is really changing the state of a system or a group of systems over time in a way that you as an organization do not approve. So if you can control that change, ultimately, that is the goal. So let's dive into each of these just briefly. So I've mentioned two types of prevention, essentially a proactive stance and a reactive stance. Both are extremely valuable and can provide different types of prevention in order to really reduce the attack surface. That's really the ultimate goal, is to make sure that you've reduced the attack surface in order to reduce the overall risk to your assets inside of your environment. And of course, with the goal of being able to support the motivations of your business users. So before we talk about what next generation antivirus is, let's talk about what traditional antivirus is. And I'm sure everyone here is familiar with a traditional antivirus. It's probably running on the system on which you're watching this presentation. So really what traditional antivirus is focused on is the malware itself. So essentially the malware, perhaps what it might connect to, and maybe some predefined behaviors, but it is malware centric. It's using signatures and heuristics in order to identify what that malware is, make a decision, yes or no. That decision happens once, and there is no follow-up from there. There's nothing really learned. It's really just a gate to say, yes, this is allowed to execute, or an activity is allowed to occur, or to block that activity or execution from occurring. Now, because most antivirus, traditional antivirus, is really not designed to record or analyze usage over time or types of threats that are being seen over time, there's really nothing ever learned. So now let's talk about what next generation antivirus is. We can what we've seen now is this next generation antivirus realm has taken a system-centric approach to endpoint security. And what I mean is looking at what is actually happening. And a lot of discussion is around the way in which that is discovered. Of course, if we're looking at patterns of attack, rather than just simply the indicators of an attack like a hash or a domain connected or an IP, now we're starting to see what the attacker is actually doing. And when we look at the actual chain of events, we can start to identify, well, what is the pattern of that chain of events, and then identify within that chain places we can break that chain, essentially. And so if we take that, we can, now, of course, this looks linear. We're taking threat intelligence, looking at patterns of events which are happening on a system, and then making a yes or no. And that yes or no could be at any point in the chain of events based on what we're seeing. Now, we're taking that information, that chain of events, and if we detect something, we block something, we're then taking that and then going back to the beginning. So look at this as more of a cycle where we're taking the insight that was provided by the chain of events. We saw something malicious, we blocked it, and we're now taking that entire chain of events and then putting it back into our artificial intelligence, building some threat intelligence around it, and then making that part of the decision cycle for events moving forward. So this is really the notion of next generation antivirus. So when we're looking at these chain of events, we're looking at tactics, techniques, and procedures, or what's commonly called TTPs. So when we compare what a traditional antivirus is looking for versus what a next generation antivirus is looking for, we are comparing essentially raw data. So you can see some elements there, hashes, IP addresses, domains, system calls. We're seeing those things as raw data. And oftentimes it's a traditional antivirus is blocking based on seeing one of these things happening without any real context. It sees it, it blocks it, and that's the end of it. Now, when we're looking at TTPs, now we're looking at things that have more context. So we're seeing a particular file being downloaded. We can see beaconing or connection to a command and control server. We have some context around that. We're looking for objects that are reading other objects, injecting into other objects, perhaps scraping memory. We're looking at all of those different types of activity, behavior, so not necessarily focused on the files, although looking at the files is part of that. So you can consider the contextual TTPs and the raw data being looked at by next generation antivirus, or NGAV. So now, how does this start to drive some efficiency in terms of what we're doing and also become more and more effective? The traditional antivirus is really driven by signatures. It's driven by heuristics being updated on a regular basis, on an ongoing basis, which has led to billions of signatures. And because the traditional antivirus is looking at what something is, that can be changed quite a bit. So an indicator of compromise, a hash, a domain, an IP address, can be changed very quickly by the attacker and is often changed by the attacker. What is not changed is their pattern of attack. So if they are using a particular vulnerability, perhaps a specific type of exploit, what is it doing after that? Is it calling to something, to let's say calculator, to then open PowerShell, to then download something? That is a pattern of attack. Those patterns of attack are not really changed very often by the attacker because it's very expensive to change that entire pattern of attack. But changing little elements within it, very easy to do. That's why we want to look at the actual TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures, because all we need to do is identify roughly about 200 of those, and that helps us to be able to stop a malicious campaign in its tracks. So the way that it looks at, the way that we want to look at it is look at, where is that attack coming from? What is the reputation of files in the chain of events, and what behavior is actually happening? So we want to compare those things which are happening on the endpoint in real time and compare it against and leverage information in the cloud, which, in this day and age, there's a ton of great information that's out there. There's a lot of great techniques in order to do this. So threat intelligence, software reputation, static analysis, looking at what the file is, dynamic analysis, looking at what it could potentially do, applying things like machine learning and artificial intelligence, and of course, leveraging some of the world's best experts in order to understand what are they seeing and how can we then leverage that into what's actually happening inside of our environment. So if we can leverage that from the cloud by looking at all of the things that are actually happening on the systems, this is where we can start to prevent the malicious campaign based on what it potentially is and what it's potentially doing inside of our environment. Now, the second part of prevention is application control. So this takes a much more proactive stance in reducing the attack surface. So every day our users are using all sorts of things inside of the environment. They are using business critical systems. We know a lot about what users are supposed to be doing. Now, if we take it a step further and look at critical systems like servers, fixed function systems like ATMs, kiosks, domain controllers, web servers, we really know specifically what those things are supposed to be doing, and we really don't want them to do anything else. This is where application control comes into play. Again, a malicious campaign is simply changing the state of a system or group of systems in your organization in a way that you don't approve. And so if you can control how your systems change on a regular basis and understand, what is the rate of change of that system, how is it supposed to change? If we're using a configuration manager, an enterprise configuration manager such as like IBM configuration manager or something like that, we can simply identify what is the trusted source of change and limit the change to only that trusted source. And that trusted source could be the enterprise configuration manager. It could be a specific publisher in our environment is allowed to, a group of applications are allowed to be installed, update, do all sorts of activities inside of our environment. We can define that relatively quickly. So if we're looking at the type of change that is allowed, we can define it by what we as an IT organization are providing to our users or to our systems or groups and systems down the line, and what are the users allowed to do? Can we set up a trusted group of sites or a trusted share internally, or can we define specifically what type of storage are they allowed to get applications or make changes to their systems from? So if we can define these things, so again, defining trust from IT, essentially defining what's allowed to update itself, install, maybe trusted directories, publishers, internal of applications. So you could simply say, trust Microsoft as a publisher, and anything that is signed by a valid Microsoft cert is allowed to run, no questions asked. So that's the way that you can really drive some efficiency in terms of defining what is trusted to execute in your environment. You can also leverage trust driven from the cloud. So if you have a software reputation service, for example, you can drive that in order to make decisions in an automated fashion. So if let's say you have a 0 to 10 rating on software reputation, 10 being fully trusted application, 0 being something that's a known malware, you could simply say, allow anything that is 8 and above to automatically be allowed to install in my environment. So again, we want to make sure that this is a relatively low administrative effort and really reduce any one-offs that may be required from an approval standpoint. But again, application control, really one of the most effective ways to reduce the attack surface inside of your environment. It's certainly a top 20 control that is often mentioned. In the realm of incident response, when the question is asked of a lot of incident responders, well, there's 2 questions that are essentially asked. How did this happen, and how do I prevent this from happening again? Oftentimes, the answer to the second question is you start utilizing application control, particularly on your most critical systems or where your most critical data, your highest risk systems that might be prone to attack. So we certainly support application control and can have some conversations about that. So now let's turn to endpoint detection and response. This is really the realm of incident response security operations. So you have a system that is a user system. There's all sorts of activity that's happening on it. When you consider traditional endpoint security solutions, those systems really are looking for what is bad and really ignoring everything else that's happening on that system. The assumption is that with a traditional antivirus, for example, that solution or the vendor of that solution knows what's bad ahead of time. Because if it's not bad, it's not recorded, it's not really looked at or analyzed. But as we know, a lot of malicious campaigns start with either novel exploits which have never been seen, and then from there, the attacker utilizes tools that are already inside of that environment. So if that attacker is leveraging Command Shell or PowerShell, Notepad, that will never be seen by an antivirus because those are all legitimate parts of a Windows operating system. So when we're considering endpoint detection and response, we want to start collecting information about what's happening in our environment irrespective of a threat that's detected. What you want to think of it as is a security camera, and a security camera can be used in a couple of different ways. You can think of the convenience store model where security cameras are on, they're recording, and really they're only viewed when some sort of detection is occurred. Some sort of incident occurs, we can rewind the tape and then see the entire story unfolding. Or you can consider it as a casino model, which is the cameras are constantly rolling, and they're also humanized behind each one of those camera lenses in order to actively see what's going on. So that's essentially detection, response, security operations. So really what you want to have is continuous recording on those endpoints. You want to record some very critical things that really tell the story of what's happening inside of the environment. And there are 6 examples here: file registry modifications, looking at cross-process events. Certainly we want to see what's injecting into other things. Of course, we want to see every file execution that's occurring, network connections that are being made at the process level, and of course, a copy of every single binary that's executing in the environment, and the relationships between all of these different elements. The reason why we like to look at these things is it's because incident responders, post-incident, try to build this story forensically, and generally forensics involve physical access to systems, cracking the drives, looking at memory, and then trying to build that story essentially like a crime scene, going back, collecting the evidence and then trying to build the story, versus a camera that's running all the time and has that story. So if you can continuously record these types of elements and then centralize them, now you have answers right at your fingertips, essentially at all times. And so this is really, from an incident response and security operations standpoint, what is highly valued by the most elite teams that we work in. So again, continuous recording and centralized storage of all of the events of every system that is operating inside of your environment. It's very key. So the reason why this starts to come together is there was an example from a customer of Carbon Black's that was looking at the operations of their systems last November. And so you can see the date timeline there. And one of the interesting things that we knew about this organization is that they have 5,000 systems. And so that's the red line at the top there. At no time throughout their operations over this time period were all 5,000 systems connected. And so if you look at essentially one of the low points in the number of systems that are on and actively connected to the network, what if a breach were to occur there? And interestingly enough, if you look at the dates there, that point is Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving in the United States. And you can imagine that there isn't going to be a lot of high system utilization at that time. But if a breach is discovered and you want to try and get answers from systems, or you have an incident response team either internally or have a one on retainer, for example, and want to start analyzing what's going on, it's going to be tough to get those answers unless you have already recorded all of the activity on your endpoints and centrally stored them. Now all you have to do is just simply look at the information that was collected, and you can start to quickly get answers as to what was the breach, what was the scope of the breach, which systems were involved, how did it happen, what happened as a result, and start to get into the remediation phase relatively quickly. As opposed to if you need to wait for systems to then come back online, let's say Monday after Thanksgiving, for example, that following week, that essentially slows down the ability to understand what happened and, of course, mount a quick response and, of course, be able to, eradicate that potential campaign that may be still active inside of your environment. The other thing that is also a great part of having all of this data centralized and recorded is being able to then do a couple of things. Either output it to a SIM or analytics engine to analyze the types of events that are happening inside of your environment, or to be able to leverage threat intelligence that is available from all of your security vendors. One of the great things about being in security at this time is that basically every vendor has some sort of security or threat intelligence that's being pumped into its solutions. Now, the challenge then becomes is how do you orchestrate that information? A lot of times, threat intelligence is really nice to have unless you can apply it to the actual events that are happening inside of your environment. And this is where having an endpoint detection and response tool comes into play and really can start to leverage that. So if you have a tool that then integrates among all of the different disparate systems, as well as looking at network security information, alerts, and of course, threat intelligence coming from network security. Now you can start to then see, here are events, raw events being recorded. They're centralized. Now we're overlaying all of this great threat intelligence, and now we can start to prioritize. We can start to triage the events, the alerts that are coming in to better prioritize the alerts that we need to take action on. So you can start to then leverage, if my firewall vendor or firewall vendors are saying that this activity or this particular set of a chain of events is bad, and we're also comparing it against raw threat intelligence or maybe verticalized threat intelligence, plenty of free threat intelligence that's out there these days. And of course, we're able to compare the endpoint security data maybe to other things that are happening. Maybe we're comparing it against physical security systems as well. Now we can then start to prioritize okay, this is something that's happening on my CEO's, my CFO's system. It's happening. This is something that's happening in a data center. We can see key card access here, or maybe there was no key card access, and maybe it was some sort of access coming in from a country that your organization doesn't do business in. You can start to see those things and then bubble those up to the top, and that's where we can take great action. Just to take a quick look at this briefly, this is a look at an alert that came in from a PDF that was executing inside of an environment. And just with that knowledge alone, that there was a PDF that was executing, calling, you can see, to the query user utility, which of course will return back all of the users on a particular system. We can see very interesting things. And again, this is, if we're recording all of these things and we're keeping the relationships intact, we can start to see a story here. So we can see, of course, the, what executed in this case. It was this PDF. It was executed by a user. We can see quite a bit of information about the particulars of the file, what its hash is, all of those things. We can also see what happened. And this is really the question that incident responders and security operations teams are posed with every single day. What happened after this alert, this anomalous event occurred? So we can see that there was a call to Notepad. Now Notepad is running a system. We can then see some very interesting things like that command shell and PowerShell were called. We can see reg.exe being called. So we see a lot of very interesting things happening after that point in time. And again, if we're looking at something like a traditional antivirus, maybe it catches something like this, but maybe it doesn't. If this is something completely novel for which there isn't a signature, a traditional antivirus is really posed to a default allow stance. So just simply allow something to execute in the environment. So the other part of it also is, again, let's go back to this PDF, the types of information that we're collecting. So of course we're looking at the cross-process events, module loads, network connection. So this is interesting. This is a PDF that's making a network connection. Again, if we're recording all of this information and centralizing it, the answers to, well, what else is connected to this IP address, we can quickly answer that. So that's something that we can see enterprise-wide. What are the actual, we see that PDF connecting to this IP address. What else is connected to that IP address? And so this is where we can start to get a lot of answers relatively quickly. The other part of it also is, where did this come from? So if we chase this back, we can see the PDF occurred. We can see a Adobe Reader here being called, of course, in order to open that PDF. We can apply all sorts of threat intelligence. We can see several hits of threat intelligence that are overlaid on this data. For example, the National Vulnerability Database telling us the number of vulnerabilities that are in this version of Adobe Reader. We can see Virus Total telling us some things. We can also see, for example, if our firewall gives us an alert, we could see that here as well. But ultimately, if we're trying to identify what the root cause of this campaign was, we can quickly chase it back to see Thunderbird, an email client, being called here. So we can quickly see that this is most likely some sort of phishing campaign where a user potentially opened a PDF, which then set in motion all of the events that we saw. So this is really the greatest value from an endpoint detection and response tool, is being able to have these answers very quickly, whether it's responding to an incident, whether it's security operations, or if we want to be even more proactive from a threat hunting perspective. So we can start to ask questions about, what are the applications in my environment that are calling to PowerShell? Tell me all of those. So that can be something that we can do essentially proactively in order to identify if there are any actual malicious events occurring in our environment. So what I want to do is summarize here. We want to increase visibility. These are things that we can do as good guys in order to increase our capabilities from a security standpoint, and also decrease the time to resolving any security issues. Of course, we want to decrease our attack surface as well. So with visibility, we can then start to triage. We can start to really prioritize what we need to remediate. And that essentially makes us much more efficient in terms of what we're doing. We can then leverage things like indicator-based detection, such as IPs, patterns of attack, IP addresses, domains. We can then leverage patterns of attack, as I mentioned, looking for what's actually happening, be able to analyze in retrospect what's occurring inside of our environment so we can make better decisions in the future. We can also start to do more offensive things. This is where we can start to do hardening and prevention with application control. We can start to integrate our tools together in order to drive automation. So if we integrate all the different tools that we may have in our environment and start to, essentially screen out some of the lower level issues through automation, that gives us more time to do things like threat hunting, collaborating with peers across the industry in order to see what are the best practices that are happening. It really is about increasing these capabilities and, of course, decreasing time. Essentially, what we see now in terms of looking at all of these different things is we can start to see different phases of improvement inside of a security organization based on grouping a few of these things together. So immediately, visibility allows us to improve triage and remediation. When we start looking at both indicator-based or IOC-based detection, as well as looking at patterns of attack, groupings of the chains of events, and it allows us to then better understand what's happening in our environment in order to then improve what we're doing. And based on that, looking at what's happening in our environment, how our organization is actually being campaigned against, this is where we can start to do more offensive things like hardening and threat hunting inside of our environment, looking for specific things that are happening to us. Because ultimately, that's what we're motivated by as security professionals, is making sure that our organization can keep moving without disruption. We want to keep uptime going, and of course, we want to make sure that that we can continue to control our environment and reduce risk. So I do want to open it up to questions here. I know it was quite a blizzard of information, but I certainly want to be able to answer any questions there might be. And Donna, if you can perhaps give me some assistance here on any questions that may have come into the chat area, I'll be happy to answer them.
Great, thank you so much, Lynn. We actually do have a couple of questions that came in, so I'm going to read them off to you. I think you may have addressed some of them, but I'm going to go ahead and read them. I'm assuming there could be an internal silent trigger alert to alert security departments when an insider is operating inappropriately, and what causes that not to be effective? I think you may have touched on that.
Sure. Yeah. So when it comes to insider threats, there's a couple of different things that really come into play. You want to, of course, you want to have the visibility. So all of the different elements that I mentioned about the file execution, modifications to systems, access to systems, the user context in which any process is executing on a system, that all comes into play in terms of understanding if there are insiders who are accessing things that they shouldn't be, if they are connecting to servers they probably shouldn't be, or downloading certain files that have been known to be part of certain campaigns. The other thing that also is interesting from a threat intelligence standpoint is the UBA, user behavior, I forget the acronym, those types of solutions that are looking for those types of anomalies. If you've defined what is normal behavior or classified certain users, you can quickly start to see, well, I'm seeing users making, if you're in an international company, users from other offices connecting into my organization are accessing files here that they shouldn't be, or making the attempts, in fact, to access those files. So that comes, again, none of that is possible. No analysis is possible without first having visibility into what's actually happening.
Great. Another question, has any research been successful in preventing or recording what computer file screens have been captured via a non-attached smartphone camera?
Yeah, that's where it starts getting very, very challenging. When you consider endpoint security, if you consider a big matrix of, well, what is an endpoint versus what is security, and then look at, all of the different types of endpoints and then all of the different types of security that could be applied to those endpoints, when you start considering mobile devices, it really does get challenging. So if they're, and it depends on what types of pictures are being taken. If it's pictures of data from a screen on a user system, this is where controls can be put in place to prevent access to that data, so that picture can never be taken. So even prior to getting to the mobile device, we want to make sure that access to particular systems are hardened. Again, visibility really comes into play here. Understanding who's accessing what, very key there. Of course, you can set up, once you're collecting that information, you can set up any sort of, look for the anomalies of, whether it's user anomalies, people who shouldn't be connecting into particular files or systems, time anomalies. So, why is the CFO's credentials being used, connected from, a system in Europe when we're based in New York, and that CFO, we know that CFO is not traveling. So we can start to bring that stuff together. But in particular, for taking images of files, that is a very challenging topic. I'm certainly not an expert in terms of mobile security, but mobility has its own realm of pain in that with devices being brought in by users and users then having access to corporate systems, that also is very challenging. But ultimately, certainly what we've seen at Carbon Black is that what is ultimately at stake, whether it's the attack is emanating or data leakage is happening from a user system or a user mobile device, it's going to be, the target is generally a back-end server, something that's inside of, either inside of the walls, or perhaps if it's data that's stored in the cloud, it's still essentially inside your walls, figuratively speaking. So that's what we want to make sure that we're protecting, is making sure that those back-end servers where the data actually lives is being protected.
Great. Another question. For this to work, do we need to install an agent on the host, or does it gather intel by probing the host? Yeah,
the most effective way to do to gather this type of information is by having a lightweight sensor on the endpoint. The probing or polling methodology, that leaves gaps in terms of data. So generally what we see when there is some sort of probe, it's based on some sort of detection event or threat intelligence event that then probes the endpoint, maybe collects some information ahead of that event potentially, and maybe after that event. But again, this really, that probing or polling methodology requires that partly that what is bad ahead of time. So you generally have to know what you're looking for. And if you have a sensor that's continuously recording and collecting that data, irrespective of any detection events that are available, or threat intelligence that's available at that specific point in time, all that information is collected. And threat intelligence sometimes has a lag. Sometimes something isn't known. Maybe there is a campaign that could go on for weeks, maybe even months. without knowledge of a particular exploit or vulnerability or a particular exploit that's being used against that vulnerability, and we have some sort of new threat intelligence that becomes available. If that data has already been collected, we simply look at the collected data to see, well, has this happened in my environment before? And we can get that answer. If you're polling or probing a particular system, any traces of a campaign could have already been wiped off of that system. Perhaps it was reimaged. Perhaps part of the campaign is to, wipe the tracks clean. So we never actually get to identifying root cause if we're not continuously recording.
Great. We actually have two more questions.
Sure.
Is normal behavior combined with other organizations' normal behavior so that all corporations can be on the lookout for it?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's tough to define exactly what's normal inside of an environment. There is some customization, of course, that's required, but generally speaking, this is where looking at patterns of attack come into play. So if you consider that malicious actors are generally not changing significantly their pattern of attack. So what happens in the chain of events that results in the malicious actor completing their mission inside of your environment, that pattern doesn't change. So in terms of behavior, the behavior doesn't change very much. But perhaps that same actor or group of actors working independently but using the same, reusing the same attack, let's say, or reusing elements of an attack, could change everything about the attack. So what is command and control, what IPs are being connected to, or where the attack is actually being downloaded from the malicious code. They may be changing the hashes every single time, or perhaps it's changing constantly from every system to system where it's going. So with those things changing, the elements changing, but the pattern of attack staying the same, if we look at the pattern of attack, that's where we can define essentially what's abnormal. So everything else could be essentially normal inside of the environment, but we don't necessarily know what is normal. We can define normal, certainly, and this is when we consider application control, we are defining specifically what's normal for the specific organization. But if we're looking at it from a security operations standpoint, we can define better what is abnormal than what is normal. And it's when we're looking for those patterns of attack or combinations of threat intelligence that are telling us something is potentially bad or some sort of activity is potentially bad, that's where we can pull abnormal out of whatever is normal inside of the environment. I hope that was clear. But essentially, patterns of attack really tell us the story.